He never liked to think of himself as a thief. Thieves, in his mind, were crude, sloppy, desperate. They used force, they left traces, they scared people into surrendering what they held dear. He was something different, something more refined. He told himself he was a student of people, a man who could walk into a room and read the invisible ink that everyone carried on their skin, the silent language of posture, tone, hesitation, and pride. He was an interpreter of weaknesses, and more than that, an artist who could turn those weaknesses into opportunities. His education began in the most unassuming places. As a boy, he had sat at the back of classrooms and learned that teachers favored confidence over correctness, that classmates respected boldness more than honesty. When he lied about knowing the answer, the room leaned toward him as if he were a flame and they were moths. When he raised his hand with certainty, even when he was wrong, people believed him. That was the seed of his first great lesson. People want to trust confidence. The louder the voice, the steadier the gaze, the less anyone dares to doubt. By the time he was a young man, this lesson had blossomed into an instinct. He could walk into a crowded bar and find the loneliest man by the tilt of his shoulders. He could tell which woman wanted to be admired not by her words, but by the way she placed her glass on the counter, deliberately, just slowly enough that someone might notice the elegance of her hand. To him, the world was a script, and everyone was already speaking their lines before they opened their mouths. All he had to do was listen. Money came, of course, but it was never really about the money. It was about the game, the chase, the thrill of turning a suspicion into trust and trust into surrender. A man at a poker table who laughed too loudly when he lost was someone who wanted to hide his frustration. All it took was a gentle nudge of camaraderie, a whispered assurance of shared luck, to make him believe in a partnership that didn't exist. A wealthy widow, still wearing her grief like a veil, needed only a voice that sounded like care to make her feel she had found companionship again. He didn't need to take everything, just enough to make her cling tighter to him, believing that the little she lost was nothing compared to what she was gaining. The secret wasn't in what he said, but in what he didn't say. He never declared himself trustworthy. He never begged for belief. Instead, he created a vacuum, a subtle emptiness that others rushed to fill. People wanted to believe in him, wanted to project their hopes, their fears, their unspoken needs onto his silence. He discovered that the less he revealed, the more they revealed of themselves. And once he knew what they needed, he simply became it. He had rules, of course. Never press too hard, never take too much, and never leave them feeling robbed. A person who felt cheated was dangerous. They remembered, they warned, they hunted. But a person who felt complicit, who felt they had chosen to give, walked away with their pride intact. They might lose their money, but they told themselves it had been worth it. They justified the con for him, and that was the most exquisite trick of all. Over time, he became something of a legend in the quiet corners where whispers traveled. No one knew his real name. Some called him a ghost, others a shadow, and still others, with grudging admiration, a teacher. He left no trails, no bruises, no broken locks, only stories of encounters that felt like dreams until the waking came and the pockets were lighter. He was not a thief in the night. He was a mirror in daylight, showing people what they wanted to see until they gave it to him freely. But legends come with weight, and he carried his silently. For all his mastery, for all his ability to turn human psychology into a deck of cards he shuffled with ease, there were nights when he lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if he too had been conned. Not by another man, but by life itself. Had he chosen this path, or had it chosen him the moment he discovered how easy it was to bend truth into profit? He told himself he was in control, yet in quiet moments, he felt like every person he fooled was also fooling him, reminding him that trust, real trust, was something he had never dared to taste. Still, in the morning, he dressed neatly, combed his hair with precision, and stepped into the world with that same quiet confidence. People still smiled at him, still leaned closer when he spoke, still offered pieces of themselves without realizing it. And he took those pieces, polished them, and played his game again. For if there was one truth he believed without question, it was this: people never stop wanting to be believed in. And as long as that was true, his art, his con, his ultimate cheat, would never end. He had once said, almost as a joke, that people were puzzles who built their own solutions and handed them to him. It was in moments like those that his philosophy sharpened, when he watched the way people revealed themselves without even knowing. Every sigh was a confession, every glance a breadcrumb, every boast a map to their deepest insecurity. There was the gambler in a smoky backroom, for example. The man wore his bravado like a crown, slamming his cards on the table as though force could bend fate. But the cheat saw through him. He noticed the tremor in the gambler's left hand, the way his laughter rose just a little too high when luck wasn't on his side. That tremor told him everything. Here was a man drowning in debts, desperate for an ally, desperate for a friend. So the cheat leaned closer, whispered of strategies and partnerships, spoke with the voice of certainty that gamblers crave. By the end of the night, the gambler had handed over a portion of his winnings to secure the future, not realizing he was only securing the cheat's pockets. The gambler never saw it as a loss. He told himself it was an investment. And that was the brilliance. People rarely admit they've been fooled. Then there was the businessman. The cheat found him at a grand party, where the wine flowed too freely and the music softened the edges of the night. The man spoke of his empire with the pride of a king, but beneath his words lingered a shadow, a fear of collapse, a fear of being smaller than he appeared. The cheat didn't challenge his empire. Instead, he admired it, polished it with compliments that sounded too precise to be flattery. He nodded in just the right places, let silence do the work where words would have been too heavy. Soon the businessman was confessing the cracks in his empire, the lawsuits, the debts, the quiet enemies. By the end of the evening, he was seeking advice, leaning on the very man who had come to strip him of his armor. The cheat didn't need to rob him directly. He simply nudged him into placing his trust and his funds into a scheme that never existed. The man would never admit he had been conned. To admit that would mean admitting weakness. And pride, the cheat knew, was the strongest lock on the smallest of cages. But it was the widow who haunted him. He had found her at a café, her ring finger bare, yet her hands always folded, as if they remembered a weight. She was not rich by any conventional measure, but she carried a hunger for kindness, a longing for presence. He offered it freely. He spoke softly, listened intently, filled the silence she could not bear alone. When she told him stories of her late husband, he leaned in as though each word were sacred. When she asked about his past, he lied, but so gently that even he almost believed. She gave him gifts, not large but enough: a watch, a loan, a promise. Each offering was wrapped in gratitude, in the relief of having someone to lean on again. And though he took them with his usual charm, it was the first time he felt the sting of what he was doing. She looked at him with eyes that believed completely, and in that belief, he saw the life he could never live. He told himself he could stop. After all, he had more money than he needed, more skill than most would ever dream of. But stopping meant facing the silence, facing the emptiness of a life built only on deception. So he moved on, always moving, always searching for the next puzzle to solve, the next weakness to exploit. He drifted through cities like a shadow, never staying long enough for the whispers to catch up, never close enough for trust to turn into suspicion. There were moments when he wondered if he was running not from the law, but from himself. For every time he perfected the con, he also proved his own inability to connect without it. His greatest trick was not fooling others but convincing himself that he was in control, that he wasn't, in his own way, the most cheated of them all. Still, when the night fell and the streets filled with unsuspecting strangers, he felt alive again. He would step into a room, scan the faces, and smile that disarming smile. Another game, another performance, another lesson in human psychology. And in that moment, there was no guilt, no emptiness, only the electric thrill of the chase. For if the world was filled with locks, then he was the key, sliding into place, invisible yet indispensable. And as long as people continued to hunger for belief, for admiration, for love, the ultimate classic cheat would always have a stage. He moved like a man who belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. Cities were not homes to him but theaters, each with its own audience waiting to be captivated. He learned the rhythms of each place quickly. The hurried stride of the financial districts, the languid laughter of the seaside towns, the hushed reverence of cathedral courtyards. Every stage had its cues, and he was the actor who never stumbled over his lines because he never needed a script. The script was written in the desires of others. Politics was one of his favorite arenas. He knew that politicians, for all their posturing, were often the easiest to read. They were like children desperate for applause, measuring their worth in cheers and handshakes. In one city, he attached himself to a rising councilman, a man whose speeches boomed with fire but whose eyes betrayed doubt. He presented himself not as a follower but as a confidant, someone who could see through the noise and understand the bigger picture. He never asked for power directly. Instead, he fed the man's vanity, offered quiet advice that felt like genius only because it echoed the councilman's own hidden fears. Soon, the politician was leaning on him for every decision. In that shadowed space of influence, the cheat arranged contracts, shifted funds, and redirected favors so subtly that the councilman believed it was all his own doing. When the man eventually fell to scandal, the cheat had already vanished, leaving only the memory of a trusted friend who had seemed too loyal to be real. Religion was trickier, but not impossible. Faith, after all, was a currency as old as humanity itself. He never mocked it, never dared to belittle what people held sacred. That was the surest way to be caught. Instead, he cloaked himself in reverence, listened with a bowed head, and mirrored their devotion with careful precision. Once, in a town whose church bells rang every hour, he befriended a congregation desperate to fund repairs for their crumbling chapel. He became the benefactor they had prayed for, promising to help secure donations and investments. They welcomed him with open arms, grateful for his generosity. In truth, he redirected their hope into his own pockets, creating ledgers and accounts that shimmered with false promise. By the time they realized the money had evaporated, he was gone, a pilgrim called elsewhere, his name etched into their gratitude long before suspicion had a chance to bloom. High society, though, was the greatest game of all. The wealthy considered themselves immune to cheats, believing their money insulated them from naivety. But their arrogance was the very crack in their armor. He once infiltrated a gala hosted in a glittering mansion, the kind of place where chandeliers reflected in champagne glasses and diamonds sparkled like stars on human skin. He introduced himself with the vaguest of titles, an investor in rare ventures, nothing more, and watched as the wealthy leaned closer, intrigued by the ambiguity. The less he revealed, the more they imagined, and the more they imagined, the more extraordinary he became. By the end of the night, he had secured promises of partnerships in businesses that did not exist, investments in projects that were nothing but words. The irony was that the wealthy, desperate to prove their cleverness, conned themselves into believing him. Yet even amidst the glamour of these cons, there were cracks forming in his own reflection. There were nights when he stood before a mirror in some rented hotel room and studied the face that smiled so easily at strangers. Who was he beneath it all? A boy who had once discovered that confidence was a mask people adored? Or a man now too entangled in lies to remember what truth even felt like? He had mastered human psychology, yes, but at the cost of never allowing anyone to know his own. Once, late at night in a small village where no one knew his name, he sat in a tavern surrounded by laughter he had not created, by joy that did not depend on him. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to simply be a part of it, not the orchestrator, not the manipulator, but a man among equals. The thought lingered like a ghost, painful in its simplicity. He could have walked away then, could have abandoned the game, but the silence of such a life terrified him more than the danger of being caught. So he rose, left a generous tip that wasn't even his to give, and stepped back into the night. The world awaited, filled with gamblers, businessmen, widows, politicians, priests, and millionaires, all ready to play their part in his grand illusion. He walked on with the ease of a man who had never stumbled, yet inside, he carried the weight of a truth he dared not name. The greatest con of all was not the one he played on others, but the one he played on himself.